Hello, I'm Glenda Millard, the author of the book The Stars at Oktober Bend, and I've been asked to do a little interview for you about the making of the book, and I've asked my daughter Rosie to be the interviewer. So ask away, Rosie.
Firstly, tell us about the stars at Oktober Bend.
The Stars at Oktober Bend is about a girl called Alice who has been assaulted, and as a result of that she has an acquired brain injury which makes it very difficult for her to speak. Although her intellect is intact, she finds that her inability to communicate verbally is very isolating. So Alice writes poems and prose, and she pins them up all around the town where she lives, hoping that somebody will read them and that she'll connect with someone in that way. And the other major character in the book is Manny, who's been a child soldier, and he's come to live in Australia. And he has been traumatised by his past also. And when he finds one of Alice's poems, he really feels this touches him, and he wants to meet this girl and find out more about her.
And what has inspired the idea?
The very beginning idea of the story was when I read an article in the paper about a girl who was homeless, who put herself through school, and while she was doing that she joined a choir, and as a result had been asked to tour Europe with the choir. And I thought it was such a wonderful, hopeful, triumphant story, and I wanted to write a story about a girl like that.
And how did Manny and Alice's characters develop?
Initially, Alice was going to be a singer, but along the way things changed. My daughter Rosie is a speech pathologist, and she would talk to me about the different types of the impacts on people's lives who had speech disorders. And I thought that would be a really dreadful thing for someone as intelligent as Alice not to be able to communicate these ideas with other people. And so the story changed, and Alice became a person who couldn't speak or who was difficult to understand. Manny came into the picture. I had an interest in following stories about child soldiers, and I'd read extensively about the impacts of war on these children, some of whom were as young as 8 or 9 when they were taken to be soldiers. And so I wanted someone who perhaps who had suffered a trauma, who would be able to relate to a person like Alice. And so that's how Manny came into the story.
Their voices are incredibly distinct, and both their words and form on the page carry such power. Can you tell us what it was like to write them?
Alice's voice was easier for me once I decided that I was going to give them each a voice in the story. So there are 2 first-person perspectives in the story, one of Alice and one for Manny. And so for Alice, I found that easier because expressing her words or her thoughts on paper was just like an extension of her thoughts. So it was quite free-flowing, not interrupted so much by punctuation or syntax, that type of thing. With Manny's, I found it much more difficult because Manny was English was a second language for him, so his pattern of speech was quite stilted and correct and formal, and you'll notice that he often repeats himself, almost as though he's not quite sure that he's got the message across.
And what's your favourite scene?
I think my favourite scene is where Alice goes to sit on the couch up on the hill, and she talks about wearing her blue dress and how she fits into this couch like the last piece of a jigsaw puzzle. And she's also talking about wondering about someone flying overhead in an aeroplane and looking down at her in this field with all the thistles blooming and her on the blue couch. And I think it's possibly I like this scene so much because it's something that actually is true. Like I used to often, when I'd go to visit my publisher in Melbourne, I'd go by train, and there'd be a certain point in the journey, just outside one of the stations as you're nearing Melbourne, and I'd look up on this really high cutting, and there, way up on top, there'd be a couch, and I used to always think, oh, how on earth did it get there? Why is it there? And so that sort of slotted into the story nicely. So I like that part.
Who is your favourite character and why?
There are a lot of characters that I like. I think Joey's a gorgeous person. I really admire him for how at such a young age he had to kind of hold the family together. I also admire Manny very much because he's been, dislocated from his home and his family and all that he knew, and had to come and live in a strange new place and get used to the customs and the language. I love the way that he relates to Alice and lets her talk and doesn't judge her and makes her feel good about herself. But I just love Alice best of all. I really love Alice because she's a kind of a contradiction in terms, really. She's quite fragile, and yet she's so strong and determined in other ways. She's silenced, but she has so many words inside her. So I think Alice would have to be my pick.
And the book deals with a lot of difficult issues. How did you feel writing about these? Did you worry about the reader's reaction?
Not so much about the ideas or the topics, subjects that it touches on, because I think that largely young people are quite exposed to all that goes on in the world today. But for me, the concern was more whether my style of writing this book whether people would relate to it, whether they'd understand why I'd done it in this way, that I'd used to reflect Alice's difficulty with spoken language. I used no uppercase letters and minimal punctuation. The syntax is a bit disjointed. So I hoped that people would understand the reason behind it, and that once they got used to it, the story would still flow for them.
What one thing do you want readers to take away from The Stars of Oktober Bend?
Hope is always the thing that I want people to take away. That's a constant in my books, in whether it's a picture book or a novel for younger readers, or whether it's a novel for teenagers. I think that's a really important aspect. For me, it's kind of like a beacon. If the story encompasses some really dark topics, difficult topics, there always has to be that element of hope. So that's what I would wish people would take from it.
And what are your favourite Australian young adult books?
Rather than pick specific books, I probably have some really favourite Australian authors, which I would like to mention. Ursula Dubosarski, I think, is an amazing writer. She's a very unique writer, and I love all her books. David Metzenfen is another Australian writer who I think writes particularly well and often addresses issues which I think really relate to young men. And also Kath Crowley, she's a favourite of mine. She writes beautifully too.
Can you tell us something your readers might not know about you?
That I like wearing aprons, that I can't cook properly unless I have an apron on.
What advice would you give to aspiring writers?
To read a lot. I think I used to often wonder how I became a writer, because I'd left school before I turned 16 and had no tertiary education. And after I was published for the first couple of books, I used to think, how is it that I kind of know how to do this, where did it all come from? And I've since realised that it's because I was a prolific reader. We grew up in a house without television, and we read and read and read. And I just think that reading is the best preparation for being a writer.
Can you tell us what you're working on now?
Yes, I've just come back from spending a week away with an illustrator, Stephen Michael King, who's illustrated many of my books, and we're working on a picture book together. So it's been a very exciting time to actually collaborate, to be in the same room at the same time working on a picture book, which isn't the usual way things work.
Excellent. I look forward to seeing your new picture book.
Thank you.